Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today is a schmooze day, which means that I don't tell people what to talk about. I let them figure out what they're all interested in, and usually we find something that we're all been thinking about, and so we have a conversation about something that's spontaneous. So I never know what's going to come up now, but I do know the four folks who have joined me on this show already. And I will introduce them to you and ask each of them to say hi. The person who's come most recently is Alexei Prokorenko, who is an interpreter in Moscow. Say hi, Alexei.
Hello. Hi.
And in Houston is Pauline Rosenau. Are you in Houston or are you in Florida today, Pauline?
Houston. I'm in Houston today.
All right. Pauline goes back and forth between Florida and Texas. And Pauline is an emeritus political science and public health professor at the University of Texas at Houston. And in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is Peter Phillips, who has just moved to Albuquerque. He's also a retired professor of sociology in this case from Sonoma State University in California, and had decided that he was living in a forest and all the forests were burning, so he'd get out while the getting is good. And so he sold his house and moved to Albuquerque, where I gather there are not enough forests to worry about. So, okay, say hello, Peter.
Hello, thank you for having me on, Meta.
It's always fun to talk to you. Peter has done work on elites. He wrote a book which looks like a directory of all of the the richest people in the world or something. The elites, the corporate elite, right? Was that?
Well, it's more about the people that control global capital.
Right.
They're not. Well, they're all very rich, but they're not like Bezos. He's kind of independent, but the network of the capital investment companies.
Right. Okay. Well, I thought it was fascinating. And at first I thought it was like a phone book or a directory of, some outfit that you've come across their list. But I imagine it took quite a lot of work to put that together. The book was called Giants or something about
Giants, the global power elite.
Okay, good. Okay, and here in Toronto is Peter Jones, who is a professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design, and he teaches design, which apparently it's not pictures that you draw, but it's systems that you think up. So he's been very active in the drawdown movement, which I think is a very important contribution. All right, folks. Now you don't know each other. None of you have ever met before, and you're only getting acquainted. So you're going to have to figure out what you have in common. But what I'll do is I'll go from left to right on my screen because you guys are up at the top of my screen in little thumbnails. And I'll ask you each to tell me in a sentence or two something that's been on your mind lately, something that you're interested in talking about. Maybe we get around to it. So Peter, you're on my screen now. Tell me first what you have been thinking about or are concerned about these days.
Well, I'm working on an update of Giants. And so that means that companies like BlackRock, which were 4 trillion 4 years ago, managed now are 8. So we're seeing this massive wealth and concentration and increasing global inequality because of that. And I'm also thinking about the military budget that just was being pushed through Congress. Highest ever, $778 billion. We now have some 750 bases worldwide, and officially we're not in war. So I'm thinking maybe there's some need to talk about that a little bit.
Indeed, there sure is. Okay, Pauline, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm very interested in what Peter Phillips just said, but I wrote down one topic, and that is the pros and cons of a guaranteed annual income.
Okay, excellent. That's one of our.
This article this week in New York Times about the secret 20 people that were allowed to target individuals and groups without any restrictions and or following any regulations. It started in 2014. I don't know if anybody else read that, but that has kept me awake at night. I hate to think that the US allowed that to happen, but apparently it was totally secret and started in 2014 and is only now becoming public. Now that the New York Times published an article about it, maybe we will see something done about it.
What do you mean by target? What they're targeting whom and in what way?
Anyway, killing people, basically, including no restrictions on whether the targets would kill civilians, children. The normal restrictions on our bombing in enemy countries was totally lifted for this secret group.
Ooh. Well,
Yeah.
I want to hear more about that for sure.
I'll use my iPhone to look up the exact title of the article.
Mhm.
It was only the last day or two in the New York Times, but it's pretty scary. It's the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night and wishes you didn't pay taxes to a country that allowed it.
All right, good. Thank you. Peter Jones, what's on your mind?
Well, I'd have to say that the mix of large-scale issues that come together for me include really the decline of Western civilization that is in some sense evident with the decline and obsolescence of major institutions, such as we're seeing more and more money going into militarization, as Peter had pointed out about the US defense budget. When we add the black budgets, as so-called, and the and intelligence agencies, it's well over $1 trillion a year. Add to that $1 trillion a year to NATO, which is a largely obsolete institution. To me, these are not indicators of kind of a modernism or of a new modernization of a high-tech approach to military or war. They're indicators of a significant decline in any type of vision of a solidarity and of a sense of shared humanity to me. Mm-hmm. And the militarization of society is also then we have to look at, consistent with that, the media's complete support of this. And that comes from the elites, as Peter had also mentioned. I mean, so there's kind of an elite feedback that our mainstream media are not independent, are not going to present narratives that are not supported by those that pay for them, because the media doesn't have a good business model other than that. There are also some critical issues that are related to this. So as we militarize and create kind of a split society, in terms of our historical cycles, this is why I talk about it's really bigger than a decline. We're at several historical crossings. So sociologists might be somewhat familiar with Peter Turchin's work on structural demographic theory. And Turchin's cloudynamics, or cycles of history, shows that we're at a point now where there's, a complete breakdown in trust with elites, which is called inter-elite competition, and it is a cycle that he's got, and another cycle which is political polarization, which is a 140-year cycle. And so we're at a period of polarization, which is, in the US anyway, at its worst point since the last Civil War. So these all together come to me.
Yeah. Okay, well, all of you are thinking about similar and related issues. And what I wonder is, are people in Russia thinking along the same lines, or do you have primarily different array of concerns, Alexei? What's the perspective in Moscow on the topics that we all agreed we're losing sleep over?
Well, thank you for having me today, but I'm afraid I'm not the most typical Russian to ask this question, to answer this question, actually, because in many ways, I tend to oppose the mainstream views of many Russians. And one of the topics that probably I would like to mention today, which we were willing to discuss for quite a long time, actually, is environmental recent developments, which rather make me a bit sad in terms of living in a country that does not subscribe to environmental issues as such. And I think it's kind of a miracle that we really met today for a schmooze day, because I think it was this morning that I got some quite sad news of Russia's delegation in the UN vetoing, using its really powerful right of veto to turn down the UN resolution, which really linked climate change to security. And this is something that makes me a little bit sad. I think we were in the company of India and someone else. I think China did abstain from giving it a yes vote. But this reflects a really, I think, a very profound belief in the Russian society, in the Russian elite, so to speak, and Russian probably government, that Russia will benefit from climate change in a certain way. Probably they dream of a Siberia where you could grow wheat or probably rye, if not bananas, at a certain point. So I think all the good words, all the necessary words that are being said by Russia's government, whereby they endorse global warming, they acknowledge that global warming is taking place. They're all a little bit insincere in terms of their deep beliefs that global warming either does not exist or will benefit Russia in a certain way. So that makes me a bit sad, because lack of consensus among the Security Council of the United Nations. I would like to draw upon what has been said. Distinguished Peter Jones has said that many of the institutions are becoming obsolete. Maybe this brings us to a thought that the Security Council as such may be a little bit obsolete, giving the veto power for the very few nations that can really in certain ways abuse it for their own purposes sometimes. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. I'm sure every one of us would agree that the veto power is a terrible problem, and I don't know how in the world we're going to get rid of it.
I was getting that citation, and it was from 2 days ago in the New York Times, but I really recommend people look at it. Yeah. They said that there was a relatively secret group of people, and in the details of the article said there were about 20 of them that did not have to respect any of the regulations the US usually has enforced for the military, CIA, FBI, when they bomb other nations. And this group was isolated, set aside, and permitted to do anything they wanted. And they were vicious, and they killed many civilians and innocent people because they didn't have to respect the target rules that we do have in place. So that's it. They were theoretically and probably were intending to kill ISIS and people. Mm-hmm. In the end, they probably killed more children and innocent women and people than they did ISIS. And that's really, the detail quite specific, because they had this from multiple sources, and believe it or not, the sources are within the military and the intelligence community. And I think the military and the intelligence community don't like this kind of thing, when they're a small group allowed to go off on their own, have their own specific center where they work, and even the military can't tell them not to do it. Pretty frightening.
Okay, now what happened? Are these the guys setting the targets for the drone strikes, or are they more general, picking who's going to be our target in ISIS or in the Yemen or wherever?
They could do anything they wanted. It was called, and I should put this in the chat, a group was called Talon Anvil, and that means steel heel. Mm-hmm. And the title of the article is Civilian Deaths Mounted as a Secret Unit Pounded ISIS capitals. And this American strike cell, not a group, but a cell, alarmed its partners as it raced to defeat the enemy, meaning only the military and itself was opposed when they saw what they were doing. So, and
who authorized this? Was this the U.S. government, or
they weren't authorized? They were just given the money and told to go and kill ISIS people. And
the U.S. government, who gave them the money?
Much of the Defense Department budget is not public, so it came from that. But they worked in 3 shifts around the clock between 2014 and 2019. And they hit convoys, air cars, and they bombed command centers and squads of what they said were enemy fighters. But in the process, they didn't have to follow the rules in terms of avoiding civilians, children, and women, and innocent women, because not women are innocent.
Okay, and these are mostly done remotely by drones or bombers.
Yeah. And even it says the CIA and the military were very alarmed at killing people who had no role in the conflict. Farmers in the field, children, families fleeing, villages sheltering in buildings, and it's horrifying. And so makes you want to sit and cry to think that these people were huddling in a building, and it was clear that they were, not enemies that should be targeted, but this group had free reign. Again, talon, anvil, steel heel.
Okay, it sounds.
I'd like to. Can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
Because I read that article with interest, and because it's rare that the New York Times will run an inside story on the military doing something wrong.
True.
And it has been so widespread and so historical from Miley forward that the U.S. has widespread human rights abuses wherever we are. And we kill people with no regard for human life and human rights everywhere, all the time. And when saying that, and saying that there's a small isolated unit that's doing this, and they're bad and we're going to get them, it lets the rest of the military off the hook. And all the stuff we heard from WikiLeaks and all the different whistleblowers that have described the deaths, the video in Afghanistan of the people being blown up, all of that. This kind of diminishes that in some way. These are 20 bad people, and now we've exposed them.
That's really right, Peter. That's been the way these types of incidents have been framed since My Lai. And what's changed, though, is the whole process of war fighting, as it's, which they basically called different generations, like the new generation of warfare. And so it was called net-centric war, which was moving into the era that Donald Rumsfeld and Bush were pushing with Afghanistan and Iraq. And most people didn't realize what that meant, but that meant using kind of small groups with more special forces that actually had, and this even gets into some of the books that this has been described in, like I guess Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams approach, and everything that they're actually deliberately trying to push accountability down to special forces and smaller groups so that they can work as a network rather than being under complete command and control. I think the original idea of this was supposed to be that it would be more effective and work with the population better. But of course, under the way that it has turned out, is you have, they're disconnected from reality and from any morality and reality. So they're off going rogue, but all part of this creating chaos. What's been changed in hybrid war modes, though, more recently, is that now it's moving into what they're calling Rand Corporation, and others are now referring to as cognitive warfare, or the domain of psychological operations. And so these types of horrific tactical operations that kill civilians, that use drones, create intense conditions of fear. and they're meant to create chaos. I mean, so that's what we're not being told, is that these are not only not isolated. When they're discovered, they have to have a cover story, but they are connected in the new forms of low intensity warfare. Instead of sending bombers over and carpet bombing like Laos, they are, in the Vietnam era, they are creating chaos everywhere.
Mhm.
Lord.
Yeah, it's
Yep,
That's a cheerful thought. Okay, Alexei, you want to comment on this? I hear all kinds of bad things about how Russia is a bad place, but stands some comparisons sometimes.
Well, I was thinking about how probably, let's say, great powers make great mistakes. Probably, if, for example, a country does not dispose of a big military, let's name any country like Austria, like Slovakia. I wouldn't like to offend anyone, but they don't have like a big military. Maybe they have a couple of squadrons, riflemen, guards for the president of that country, a couple of hundreds of people, armed personnel in total. So they cannot just commit any great mistake militarily, any great crime on their own. But once a country becomes an owner of weapons of mass destruction, once they start to wield a global outreach of power, maybe their mistakes become also big, and that's inevitable, an inevitable side effect of being a big country. As for the hybrid wars, this is a really kind of a new phenomenon, which some people give credit to the Russian general staff for inventing it, like in 2013 or 14. But it really would be interesting to trace it back in time, if there were any military conflicts in history that really could be described as a precursor of hybrid war, which were not wars proper, but kind of neither war nor peace. Maybe we could just trace it back to some attempts, for example, when the Peace of Brest-Litovsk set in, Lenin declared on Germans. He declared actually his policy as being neither war nor peace. So we do not wage a war with Germany because we don't have the necessary resources, but we don't really consider ourselves at peace with them. So the history of that phenomenon of hybrid war can really be interesting to investigate in order to counter this sad phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what would the hybrid war between Russia and, well, let's say the US now, look like if we were to describe it as neither war nor peace? I see a lot of things that are quite innovative, the use of disinformation, and it's probably mutual. We don't hear how the US is doing it to Russians, but I'm very interested in the use of the internet and manipulation of social media to create dissent and discord and animosity, and possibly even the outcome of elections. That to me would be an example of a hybrid war that's neither war nor peace.
That's a good example. That's consistent with this idea of what Pepe Escobar, who's an independent journalist who's written a lot about Afghanistan. He warned 20 years ago about what happened in Afghanistan now. So he's been writing about it a lot recently. He writes for Asia Times, and he's on social media. But he's the one who coined this term, I think, of empire chaos, which is essentially creating not full out declared wars, but constant low intensity interventions which may create fear and that keep uniformed military off guard, off balance. And certainly this has been the U.S. strategy in Syria, which is an undeclared kind of hybrid war. Remember Trump talking about trying to pull out of Syria 4 times. And he finally gave up and said he gave into kind of the intelligence community that always wanted to keep some troops behind, or even the military proper. The Pentagon kept insisting that they would leave 100 troops here. And it was in Al-Tanf and in around the area, so southeastern, eastern Syria, and toward the south, toward the border of Iraq, but close to where the oil fields were. Remember, he said we're protecting the oil. So this story about why the U.S. is even still involved in Syria is itself a hybrid type of engagement. It's neither war nor peace, and it's probably meant to keep several levels of adversaries. So Syria, Turkey, and the Kurds, who are both used and abused. They always are, right? And so they're supposedly on the U.S. side, but the U.S. will betray them at a moment's notice. And then this is meant to keep Russia off balance as well. And Russia, of course, being the world's, world's largest LNG provider, and who's got the contract for pipelines through there. Pepe Escobar says this is basically all about the pipelines. But, but these conflicts are meant to stall these projects, like we're seeing.
I'm sorry, wait a minute. Hold on. Are you saying that pipelines go through Syria?
Yes. So
I didn't know that.
At the point at which actually ISIS was discovered, and John McCain went to Syria in 2012, and President Obama was starting to declare, kind of a change in policy around Syria. That was right after President Assad in Syria rejected a firm offer by Qatar to provide the natural gas through one pipeline plan through Syria, through Turkey to Europe, the South Stream. And the Russian plan was accepted because, one thing, it was cheaper, and Syria is an ally of Russia, and so are the other countries that those pipelines would go through. And so it was also very inexpensive. And of course, so Assad picked that pipeline instead of Qatar. And Qatar has been a major financer of the Syrian conflict until recently. They're starting to make amends.
Okay, now wait a minute. We've got a pipeline I never heard of. Fascinating. It's already up and running, and it's been going for a while. The gas goes through there, or
no? This is like Nord Stream, right? Nord Stream 2, which has been built by Russia to come through Germany,
right,
through the Baltic Sea.
I hear about that, but I never heard.
So you've heard about that. And that's also a hybrid war thing too. So you're also now hearing, like, the new German government, the Greens are trying to say it can't be certified. This is a way of just delaying it. And of course, it's going to lead to like expensive gas and trouble for everyone in Germany. But it's that's political. That's the political side of this hybrid war. Pipelines. Pepe Escobar also wrote a book, I should say, called Pipelinistan, a small book of the publisher that I also have written with, called Nimble Books. So he's written about, he calls it Stan. In other words, that there's a type of a nation around, or a world system is what it's called, but it's an economic system of committed contracts for these pipelines, which take, decades to construct sometimes. Because of the difficulty, but they're needed. They're necessary.
But are they this southern pipeline
South
is
Stream,
functioning, or it's not up and running?
It's not yet. I don't think it is yet, but it's still. So that's actually a good question. It's a good
Alexi,
question, because in the midst of all the chaos, you don't know what the original project is doing. It's like, Are they building it in the midst of a war zone? Or are they waiting? I believe they've got a lot of the infrastructure in place, but and I think what's actually going to help kind of Syria and Russia here is Qatar has recently, in the last year, accepted Syria back into, the Organization of Arab States, or is it, one of those organizations. And so it's accepted Syria back, and it's starting to make diplomatic amends. And so they'll probably resolve this, but
Mhm.
so Alexei, do you know about this from the Russian side?
Well, actually, what we call the South Stream is a little bit different route. It leads all the way from the Russian coast of the Black Sea down to Turkey, and from there, it also faced lots of different frictions with Turkey, with Erdogan, president of Turkey, and then they were successful in building it on the actually across the Black Sea, and then it leads to Bulgaria and up to Hungary all the way. And then there is another pipeline called Nabucco, after a famous king of Babylon.
Oh,
And
there's also a Verdi opera named Nabucco. That's how I would know about it. I didn't know about the king, but I know about the opera.
So is that the name for the Syrian leg of that?
Maybe, but there is another, probably another pipeline that leads from, as you said, from Qatar to Syria, still south of those two pipelines.
Unfortunately, it sounds as if the Europeans really need that oil or that gas. It's gas, right? It's not oil, right? It's gas. And it's going to go to Germany. I understand the Germans are the ones kind of in a moral bind, whether or not, I mean, they're pretty annoyed with Putin's amassing of troops on the border, but they're not, there's a real question now whether they're going to reject that pipeline when it's ready to run. They could turn it on any minute now if they wanted to. Yeah, right. So what, by the way, let's talk a little bit about what you in Russia think is going to go on the border of Ukraine, because everything that we read here says it sounds like most public opinion is like 50-50. The odds are it would be crazy for Putin to do it, but he very well may. And what do people in Moscow think is going to happen?
Well, from what I'm reading about this issue, of course, it's also 50-50. I'm trying to grasp, get hold of different kinds of political currents, different kinds of analysts. But in the long run, it's like tossing a coin. Really, many times, many analysts were proven to be wrong. So if you bring me back to 2013, or for that matter, any serious analyst who is based on logical thinking, that is detecting certain trends that we can observe now, and making a dotted line into the future, or predicting some changes that would happen, so some curves that would happen in the future based on what we saw in the past. But no one would really think that Russia would ever invade Crimea or make a proxy war in the east of Ukraine. So now most people still, like a slight majority of people, think that it will end in a show-off, like a military show-off, like trying to make a bargain with the West, because really, in terms of Putin is a rather practical politician, if we may say so. He's always calculating the odds of winning or losing, more or less. Although he sometimes gets mistaken, doesn't get it right, like it was with the Crimea. He really received lots of sanctions imposed on his regime, which really is not something that he was willing to get. And
that surprised him, you think? You don't think he really thought that was going to happen, that they would?
Because in prior to that, like 6 years, 5.5 years before that, in Georgia, he got away with that. Mm-hmm. There was we don't call it a war. We officially call it, in our media, we call it coercion to peace. So like we coerced Georgia to stop its aggression against It's former provinces. That's what is officially, this conflict is officially called. But in fact, he got away with it, and this was something that could have triggered the Ukrainian events. But now he knows that he will have to pay a price for a large-scale war. And if we look at the practical side of it, I don't really think we have to consider some moral aspects. But if we look at the practical side, he's going to lose a lot more than he could ever win from a large-scale war, from a full-scale war in Ukraine.
Well, maybe he hopes that he won't have to have a full-scale war. He just invade, and the Ukrainians will forget about it, and nobody from Europe or the U.S. will intervene. NATO will not intervene. So maybe he's, I don't know, guys. What about you folks in the U.S.? I'm talking from a Canadian perspective. Peter and Pauline, what do you think?
I just keep thinking about the pipelines that we're worried about between Canada and the US and how that's been going. I mean, it was opposed for many years, but I think we've got it coming right now. All that Canadian petroleum and coming from the Great North right into the US, North Dakota, South Dakota. We'll get the resources if one way or the other.
Okay.
I think it's important to understand that the motivation around Ukraine is to protect and grow concentrated global capital and protect the transnational capital class and their interests, which is growth and expansion. Ukraine, under the sphere of Russia, we spent billions of dollars. When I say we, it was Western intelligence agencies spent billions of dollars to engineer a coup there using extreme right-wing fascist organizations to create a government that was in opposition to Moscow. And the people in Crimea, who were mostly Russian, decided they weren't going to go along with that. And so we say, well, Russia invaded Crimea. No, they already had bases there. They weren't going to give up their naval bases. And so that has been protected. Now, whether or not Russia will, occupy the Ukraine, I think they're basically, establishing a right to do so based upon their historical circumstances. And that we're also seeing now that the G7 is stepping in, which is interesting because they really represent the capitalist classes in the various major economies. They're stepping in and saying that collectively will punish Russia economically. I'm not sure what that means, other than maybe cutting off gas spigots and other things, but they will punish Russia economically and target Putin and others if they do invade. So I thought that was an interesting circumstance in terms of how that's been engineered. We of course engineer coups all over the world. We did it in Libya. We attempted to do it in Syria. We certainly did it in Baghdad, and that's to benefit concentrated global wealth and continued expansion of capital.
Yeah, I agree with Peter. That's very much how I see it, and kind of the sweep of history up to today. If we look at what President Putin has been doing with the G7, I've noticed as I follow Sputnik and some other, streams of news from news feeds, that Putin is reported to be in conversations with Boris Johnson, with Macron, with Germany, like every day. So his phone call, his meeting with Biden was supposed to be a big deal, but he's on the phone with the world leaders from the Europe G7 for diplomacy, not to like put up red lines. Basically, the red line that he's saying is he's reminding them, and this is actually in the news briefs, he's reminding them that he's going back to the agreement that NATO made, or Helmut Kohl made, with Gorbachev in 1991, that NATO would not move an inch to the east. And now that it's all the way up to Russia's borders, basically, he's just reminding them that you said this in 1991. We remember these things. We're holding to that.
Hold on. It wasn't it wasn't the Germans that they made that promise.
What's
It was
Helmut
the
Kohl?
US. The US
Well,
made that promise.
It was Helmut Kohl and the U.S. diplomat for Bush Sr. at the time, I guess, but the U.S. was the one that would have betrayed it. I mean, Helmut Kohl feels very badly about this, I guess, in terms of when he was asked.
I think it was James Bush who made it in, that statement.
James, not Brady, but yeah, it was Baker. It was James Baker.
Baker. Yeah. I beg your pardon. That's what I meant. Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, they treat it as a commitment, though, and I mean that's something to consider. Russia's view of history is you did this a long time ago. We're still holding you to that. And when Bush broke the ABM treaty and then Trump the INF treaty, Russia just like, okay, we'll stop honoring that treaty too, and we'll work on that. So, I mean, I think they're being really clear about pushing back diplomatically, but using.
Well, yeah, but he should have put it in writing. I mean, Gorbachev should have demanded that it be written down, because Clinton comes along and says, well, every country has a right to decide what alliances they want to join. So if these Eastern European countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union decide they want to be part of NATO, who are we to say that they shouldn't make that decision? That's their perfect right as sovereign
them before they made that decision. I mean, we go in and do a color revolution and then say, do you want to join NATO? So we've overthrown them first, and then of course they go along because we've kind of paid them off, and that's the US way.
I'm in favor of a lot of those color revolutions, but that's another matter. Go on. Alexei, I interrupted you. You were
in fact, there's a lot of things I could say about this, being like a maverick in Russia in terms of Putin's regime. And I could start with some misconceptions that were instilled into the minds of the Crimeans when they, quote unquote, voted for their first independence and then joining Russia, because one of the great misconceptions that that was really conveyed to them is that they would not be allowed to speak Russian. They would have to speak Ukrainian instead. And in the Crimea, they might. No one really speaks Ukrainian well. They of course they understand it. They watch television in Ukrainian. They always did during the years when they belonged to Ukraine. But they were. It was so presented that they would not. That they would be. They would have problems for talking Russian, which is not cannot be true, because even in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, you in 70% of the cases you will hear people speaking Russian to each other. It takes a trip westwards to Lviv and the west of Ukraine, where you could bump into a person who doesn't even understand Russian quite well. But central Ukraine, the bulk of Ukrainians, like for 80 or 90% of Ukrainians, Russian is a native language. And in the new government after the coup of 2014, there were a couple of ministers who were not able to speak Ukrainian. They spoke Russian. So this is obviously one of the tenets of that referendum voting was absolutely not true, was absolutely made up, let's say. So that's what I would say about what happened in the Crimea.
Interesting. Why don't we discuss kind of what we think we might be able to. So as a design professor, I work with a lot of system change or projects, and we teach approaches to using systems thinking and good social theory in a reality testing way to construct proposals and plans and coalitions for effective change. And I've helped start a number of organizations such as Drawdown Toronto, based on the main Drawdown program. We have an economic change project called Bounce Beyond, where we're working with kind of what we call next economies, new types of regional or bioregional, ecologically flourishing, new economic arrangements. And so I'm looking for ways in which, people like us who are thinking, who can see, the reality of how these kinds of complex problems unfold, but we're also the people that should be talking about and helping inform some of the approaches to change. And so I work with education and kind of forming groups that can get larger and bring dialogue and education together. I brought World Beyond War, and that's actually how I finally met Meta, brought the World Beyond War conference to Toronto in 2018 to my school. And I've been a chapter head and been working with them since. I think they're a great organization. But these are kind of, in a way, like new diplomacy organizations too. I think they can have an impact on, on kind of multi-track diplomacy in a way, even though, so Peter, we haven't yet gotten to the point where we're influencing elites. And I think elites have become more sheltered. They've, what's the expression? They circle the wagons, or they've become isolated. They put up a fort. They don't want to hear from groups like ours. I think they've been attacked. And so, but I think we need to have more exchange and porosity of our ideas with elites.
Elites are very aware of the global crisis and potential war and the environmental crisis. The Great Reset that's ongoing through the Davos folks is essentially addressing those issues. But their agenda, of course, is to maintain structural capitalism and concentrated wealth. So that's the number one priority. So they want to try to address, some of these crises and try to get corporations to do nicer things to their workers and not pollute so bad. But we're definitely going in the wrong direction. And I think part of this, it's interesting because I watch what the Atlantic Council is saying. The Atlantic Council, of course, is a transnational organization of capitalists, essentially, closely tied to NATO and international security issues. That 6 years ago, as Ukraine was evolving, they came up with a formal policy recommendation to have a regime change in Russia. They have recently come up with a policy issue to have a regime change in China. Now, when they come out and say that, and these are collective elites saying that we want to undermine the Russian government, we want to undermine the Chinese government, we want to transform the world into global capital, no matter, essentially no matter what the consequences, because we're destroying the world in the process. So I think when we say about elites that they're pretty well organized, very, very perceptive of what's happening, which is why I write books about who they are, because I think we need to know who they are. And I think that's a process of really understanding where power lies.
Do you ever actually have any personal contact with these folks, or you just look in their on their websites for the information? How accessible?
I've had a few off the cuff interviews, but no, they don't really do interviews with political sociologists that are criticizing their structures. I'm thinking a little bit more of trying to maybe do some of that, but most of this is online through corporate proxy reports. You can trace who's what and who they are and build background things, which is what I did. But the concentration of wealth in these global wealth management companies is just amazing. I don't know where it is today. It was $40 trillion 4 years ago. It's probably double that, if not more, where a few hundred people are controlling that amount of capital.
Okay. Are there any good guys in that group? And if so, how many and how are they? Do they know each other? That could you play one half of them off against the other half?
Not very well, because they all have capital interests that are similar. So yeah, there's people who are more liberal than others. There are people who are more willing to address environmental crisis than others. I mean, if we look at what's really going on in the world, we're talking the top 20% of the people have almost all the wealth, and the top, 1,000th of 1%, this transnational capitalist class, some 6,000 people, that they're the ones really making the calls and deciding, and they manage global capital. There's no intention of giving that up. Maybe sharing it a little bit more might be something that we keep saying we could try to do.
Well, I mean, now and then you hear people like Buffett say things like, I'm too rich, you should take it away from me, basically. You know, and I, you know,
He is too rich and we should take it away from him, but that's.
Well, now it's more Gates and Bezos and actually what you're hearing from a more humane perspective might be Elon Musk of all people. He's kind of a popular figure now, not hated.
Time man of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's being contrarian too, which I think, which probably gains him a lot of favor among the plebes like us. But you're really correct here, Peter, that even if we look at dissension among these folks, I'm pretty close to some of them through these kind of NGOs I work with, including the Club of Rome and these. I mean, I work with the UN SDG program closely in a lot of work. I work, you know, so my students work with the UN directly and are in well-placed positions. And I'm like just 2 steps away. I'm at the same conferences and things. And I don't ever go up directly against him, but I will introduce like different narratives and different suggestions that people are moving in a different direction. And I guess this is where kind of the design approach can help, is that we can actually construct different, if you will, campaigns, visualizations, interjecting into culture. This is where art and design can help. But I mean, it isn't going to be leading, but we're going to be collaborating in ways where we can create provocative insights about alternative futures and do that in a really smart way. I mean, we need to keep, because there's a new study out, which is done by, Rensselaer Polytechnic, that shows that if 10% of a population holds firm to a committed idea, and it's at least 10%. If it's below that, it dissipates. But at 10%, it's got a tipping point, and it will take hold and continue to grow. And it basically can't be overthrown. So this is all
very
all
true.
takes. Yeah.
I was thinking about you, Peter, and when I read your background, can't we design a system that maximizes democratic participation at the lowest possible levels? And kind of like an anarchy approach to the world, meaning people make decisions about their lives where they are, and having systems that help them do that.
But doesn't that assume that the political leaders then have some kind of say, or that they can be held accountable? And the problem, from what I read about this New York Times article, is that this project spanned Obama, Trump, and now Biden, and none of them either know anything about it or are able to control it because it's buried and the budget's so big, and it's at the point where responsibility and accountability is extremely difficult to hold people to. Yeah, leaders and the elected leaders. That's what I find very upsetting.
Well, I think we trusted leaders too much. I mean, I actually think at the presidential level, they're gatekeepers and holding the bureaucracy in place. Even Trump did that. Well, what he did that they didn't like was he lopped off a lot of senior employees from the State Department and places, you know, and other departments. And so that created a lot of enmity, and the media hated that too. I mean, because there were clubs, but he still kept the bureaucracy in place. And that's really, the bureaucracy serves global capital, as Peter's pointed out. I think, I mean, the Pentagon is almost like an independent institution. What Peter's suggesting, and I agree with you, is that it is almost like, it is a type of syndicalism. And I think of it as solidarity and subsidiarity, but in a way that ought to be more cultural. And I don't know if I've mentioned this to Meta before, but I mean, I had this idea for foreign policy that we ought to be using a type of cultural empathy, like the way that we have Alexei. We should have people from all the countries that we believe our leaders are in adversarial relations with. We should have diplomatic relationships with the people. We should have empathy and understanding for what's going on, and we should start to form point-to-point communications, networks, and relationships that can create alternative systems that will be resilient in the future. I mean, and this is why people are fans of cryptocurrency. They believe that might enable those types of exchanges, and social media. Now, so many people on Telegram, which Germany's trying to ban because people use that as a way to actually organize, which is great if you're on the side of the elites and you're organizing the Arab Spring as Google, which benefited the elites. We didn't know that at the time. I did, but most people thought, I mean, it was pretty obvious to me it was another color revolution, but, you know, people think it's going to be good. And it has, you know, we need to work, I think, at a more democratic level, of a real democratic level, people to people.
I like the notion of citizens' assemblies. And I have a vision for how to replace, this is absolutely the wrong time to bring this up, and I'm maybe going to edit it out. I don't know. But I think in terms of creating a citizens' assembly for the world, in which people can use their cell phones and vote by cell phone, and people would vote on not on the basis of what country they live in. Let's say the UN Parliamentary Assembly would be created not to represent countries, but to represent people whose birthday is August 29th. My birthday is August 29th, and everybody in the world with that birthday would vote on the same day, and we would elect some people. So all of the August 29th people would be represented by one delegate to the Parliamentary Assembly at the UN. And that way, nation states would have nothing to say about it. So, and you can vote by cell phone. So that's my general idea.
Cool.
Want to swing at that before we go?
But did you know, Meta, that some birthdays are, for unknown reasons, much more popular than others? We don't choose them, but babies just seem born.
Well, I think we can live with that amount of inequality compared to the amount of inequality that we have now.
Well, there is something to the random selection of participants in the idea of the citizen jury, and the other approach, which, I mean, I'm not against that, but the approach that I use is based on systems theory called requisite variety, where we carefully analyze who the stakeholders are that are going to be subject to a bad decision and who are invested in a good decision, and who ought to be involved as, you know, rings of stakeholders from the core to the periphery. And then intersections of diversity, so between ages and socioeconomic status, geographies. So you try to get a type of UN, you know, of careful UN style representation of the social system, and then get them engaged in dialogue. Whether they have the final vote, I don't know, but that's my approach to dialogue. And
in your system, they will.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we've got some creativity juices going here, but it's a little late in the conversation to elaborate. You'll have to give me a phone call or something, Peter, to explain to me exactly how your system's going to work. Maybe I'll join with you and we'll have an alliance to overthrow somebody. I'm not quite sure whom I want to overthrow, but Peter's got a list.
Listed in my book.
Yeah, I'll work with your list. We'll handle them alphabetically, Peter Jones and I. Peaceful people have enemies too. You know, anybody who opposes you, basically.
Unless they mess up with me or my family.
Okay. Well, this has been fun.
I appreciate this. Thank you.
Very good to meet you. Yeah, let's
happy holiday season.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 384. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you do get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show that you want to watch, Enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is the place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.